Last week, we talked about various subjects, but in particular, we were talking about your understanding of Jesus on the cross and the subsequent resurrection. And I mean, I think the main thing that I wanted to communicate is the fact that when you adopt a historicist interpretation of Jesus on the cross, the crucifixion and resurrection, there's various different options that you're faced with, depending on whether you want to be a supernaturalist about the resurrection and say that this was a literal event that happened where a person actually came back from the dead, or you can actually be a non-supernaturalist about it and create different versions of that narrative to eliminate being forced to believe in something supernatural happened. And for example, at one point you said that perhaps Jesus wasn't really dead, and that maybe his heart was still beating a bit or something, so that when he was put in the tomb, he was still partially alive. So that you would then be able to accommodate the idea of him being resurrected without having to believe in the scientific impossibility of somebody coming back from the dead after multiple days of being dead. I mean, does that make sense, that there's like a supernaturalist and a non-supernaturalist version of the historical interpretation of Jesus' resurrection?
No, it does. And I think this is like one of the major things people wrestle with in their minds, trying to make sense of whatever they believe, whether it's the supernaturalist version or, like a feasible version for them that they might conjure, like the one I said, but I'm not saying that was concretely what I thought. It was just a way someone could rationalize that happening, without having to adopt all the supernaturalist baggage.
Yes, exactly. There's even quite a specific version. You might have come across it where people have said that he moved to India after he was not exactly resurrected. But have you ever heard that version of the story?
Yeah, I've heard. People suggesting that he may have been influenced by Hinduism and religions like that, or Buddhism. I've heard of it. I've never tried to confirm it. I don't know how deeply you've ever tried to confirm any of these things. Because I've heard, like, I think even Alan Watts said, it's very possible that Jesus knew about Hebrewism, maybe a little bit about Greek religion. Those things are probably for sure. You can probably be more sure about that than his influence with Hinduism. Because I think he would say, he didn't say Hinduism, but I think what Watts would say that there's no evidence that he knew about Taoism or anything like that.
Sorry, there's no evidence, did you say?
Yeah. I believe that's what he said. I could be off, but I don't know. I don't know if he doubted maybe an Eastern influence, like on Christ, like from the Eastern religions. But I don't know. There may be. I've heard a lot of it the other way too, like you said, that he may have been influenced by the Indian religions.
Right. So I mean, the general picture that emerges is that the historicist reading of the Jesus story, which is to say that the version of the story which says that there was a particular single historical individual that the stories are about, they ultimately refer to this person and his life and his exploits. It's a very malleable storyline, and it's open to quite a variety of different ways of reading the story. And I think one of the major distinctions is supernaturalist versus non-supernaturalist, which all comes down to things like the resurrection and also the miracles that Jesus was said to have performed during his lifetime, whether or not they were actually magical and whether the resurrection was an actual kind of magical event where a dead body came back to life, or whether there are more grounded materialist scientific ways of understanding what that could have been about. So maybe for example, when he turned water into wine, maybe that was just a cheap kind of parlor trick that he did, as opposed to some godly thing where he had some divine power to actually make matter transform. So anybody who is adopting the historicist version, the historicist interpretation of Jesus, you've kind of got to pick one or other. You've either got to go full religious, full kind of magical version of the story and say that these things are real, or else you've got to say that there were rational and scientifically grounded explanations of these stories. And it sounded, to start with, when I was asking you what you believed about the resurrection, that you didn't want to commit to any kind of supernaturalist explanation, and that rather you wanted to say that the crucifixion was a literal, real story that happened to a real person, but that the resurrection was not. And you also started to bring in the idea of metaphor in terms of the resurrection as being perhaps a description of a spiritual resurrection. But then I pointed out that you can't really do that if you're going to read the crucifixion idea as being a literal event, because that would mean that the spiritual resurrection would have had to have happened after Jesus was dead, which doesn't really make much sense. And so that kind of brings us up to where we got in the last conversation that we had on this specific topic of the meaning of Jesus, and specifically the meaning of the death and resurrection. And I just wanted to really emphasize why it's really, really important to get on the same page about this, because the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is the centerpiece of Christianity and also of the Catholic Church. So it's hugely important, arguably the most important religious story in the modern world, right?
Yes, I agree. I guess if I had to answer that, like I know I had sent you a few emails after that, and what I was trying to, I don't know if you watched some of the links I tried to associate with the conversation.
Yes.
But I suppose the emphasis that I was trying to pour was that not to, I wasn't trying to make a strict point of whether I believe Jesus was a literal person or a metaphor. I suppose I do that, because what I'm really trying to argue is, what in both instances, like whether, you believe he was a literal person or not, what he represented, the love, unity, mystical experience, I think that's more to the point, and, even the early mystics, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but I don't know if you ever looked up like Simeon, the New Theologian, or Bias of Peen, the real early Christian mystics they called a Theoria. Have you come across that term?
Well, I know the word Theoria. It's related to words like theurgy, right?
Yes.
I think Vladimir Lossky talks about Theoria. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's basically a term for mystical experience, but in the Christian tradition.
Yes, you could say that. And so what these early theologians would say, anytime they were dissecting scripture, they didn't go by their own intellect to try to figure out what it was. They would look to Theoria, or how they distinguish between true spiritual knowledge or false spiritual knowledge was by having the mystical experience. Like that was the emphasis. And I guess scripture was more trivial to them. A lot of them would say only interpreted by analogy and metaphor. And they emphasize that.
So you're saying that the ancient Christians, just to summarize what you're saying that the ancient Christians were mostly concerned with mystical experience before, ahead of a concern with scripture. Yes.
Right. And I don't know if some of the writings of Simeon, the New Theologian, I really love them, man. He said he really believed. I mean, that was his main principle, that everyone should experience, all creatures. For the way they interpreted was interesting too, because it wasn't something that they saw subjected to human beings. They saw it as a potential in all creatures, kind of like how the Hindus saw it, or the Buddhists, how they see it as a potential of all sentient beings. And not only that, but it was necessary for their spiritual and health and mental health. And I think it's no surprise that today that, the studies with mystical experience are showing that all the benefits of people to stop smoking, coming to terms with death, so on and so forth. They're just because the Buddhists, they say something very similarly. And I think in the Nirvana Sutra, I don't know if you've read the Nirvana Sutra, but basically the Nirvana Sutra is that all beings should have nirvana, because it's because they thought the same way. It's towards your spiritual development. And the science going on in Hopkins, I think, is just re-echoing all of that. It's re-echoing that because it's showing how the majority of the volunteers are benefiting from this experience.
Right, a kind of psychotherapeutic in sense of benefit.
Yeah, cathartic, and like I don't know if I mentioned this last time, man. I don't, stop me if I have, but I don't know if you listen to a lot of Michael Pollan talks.
I've heard him talk, and I've read a few things that he's written, so I get the general idea. He certainly is very supportive of the psychotherapeutic benefit idea of mystical experience. You were talking last time about how he was talking to people who had terminal cancer, who had psilocybin therapy, and how you mentioned that he was kind of jealous of the extreme mental benefits that these cancer patients were talking about from their psilocybin experiences.
Yeah. There was one, I don't know if I got to mention it last time, but there was one, he talks about a few individuals in particular, but there was one in particular that her name was Dina Baser. Do you recall that name?
No, not in particular. No. What was her story?
So, he was saying that she was one of these cancer patients that and her anxiety was so frustrating that they couldn't even invite her to go to dinner because she was so scared of when she it couldn't allow her to enjoy the moment because she was so scared of death. And she's like any day now, and in the experience, Michael, I mean, he says it real eloquently, but she saw her cancer as a black mass underneath her rib cage. And she said it couldn't really be the cancer itself because the cancer is located in her lung, so it was in the wrong area. So she identified it as her fear. And in the middle of the session that she was in, she just yelled, "Get the fuck out!" And of course, the people there watching over her, the professionals, are just alarmed. They don't know what to think, but they just let her be. But after the experience, she explained what was going on, and she said after she yelled that black mass just vanished, like it evaporated completely. And so when Michael heard this story, Michael Pollan heard this story, he went to go write about it, I think in the New Yorker. And the New Yorker fact checkers went back to Dina, and because Michael had written something like, Dina said her fear was substantially diminished after psilocybin session, right?
Right.
And so when the fact checkers went to Dina, they said, and said, "Was your fear substantially diminished?" And she said, "No, Michael got it all wrong. My fear was completely exterminated." Like, wow. There was no fear. Like, and so, when you have that happen and you're in a state of anxiety all the time and you're constantly fearing death, and then you have something like that happen, you can enjoy the rest of your life in content. And, that's how beneficial these experiences are. And, I don't want to underestimate them, and I'm sure you don't either.
So to tie that back to what you were talking about, the early Christian mystics, what you're saying is that these early Christian mystics were very well aware of this therapeutic use for mystical experience.
Yes. Yeah, I believe they were. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, in other words, you're saying that the concern of the ancient Christian mystics was mystical experience ahead of Scripture. So, for them, just to tie it back with the theme of the historicity of Jesus, it didn't really matter whether the Jesus stories referred to an actual person, because the mystical aspect of the stories was first and foremost. It's what the most important element of the story, regardless of whether there was a particular person, Jesus, or not.
Yeah, I mean, man, I don't know how deeply you studied that, but it's kind of a hobby of mine. And I mean, it was so much to the point where in order to even be a theologian during those times, you had to have had Theoria. And the way the mystics, the theologians would recognize it is because they had it. That's how they became the theologian in the first place. So they could recognize it in the theologian that finally attained it, or however you want to phrase it, they finally had it. And so that's how they're accepted. And it was said that if you had Theoria, then yeah, you didn't have to rely much on scripture. I'm sorry, on scripture. After that, like I think they said, for some theologians, they had to have a certain knowledge of the scripture in order just to preach. And but if someone had Theoria, that wasn't necessary. They could preach without it.
Right. Okay. So, because this I thought was a very interesting shift in the conversation that we had last time. When I first asked you about your interpretation of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, it sounded very much to me like you were fully adopting a historicist interpretation.
Yeah, I apologize about that.
No, it's fine. It's worth analyzing, though. It's worth kind of spelling this out.
No, it is, and you kind of caused me to do that, man. I thought I went the whole week thinking about that, and the chronological order that you talked about, how it couldn't be, how you have to kind of go through a mental gymnastics to accept it in a certain way, and while ignoring the order of the events, or you made me really mull it over, man. But I guess my point for me, I guess I've never looked at, I guess what I was trying to say is I never found, I don't know why I never decided to look so deeply into it to assess which is true, I guess, because my emphasis has always been, to point people to the experience.
Right. So the shift that occurred in the middle of the conversation was, to start with, it sounded like there was a firm commitment to historicity, but then you shifted to the position that it does, which is the position that you're now expressing, which is that it doesn't really matter if there was a historical Jesus or not.
I wouldn't say that it doesn't matter. I think it's very important, and for some reason you're emphasizing it, far more emphatically than I am, and I'm very curious to hear, your explanation. I guess I don't know. I guess I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I guess I tend not to nitpick over things like that, especially because I spend a lot of time in atheist threads, for instance, and I've caught into atheist shows talking about this stuff. And even before you spoke to me, I was watching a stream that was, they always air them on Sunday, I guess, to be even more blasphemous. I don't know. I'm joking, but. But there's so many going on today, and one of the ones that I really was getting into is they were trying to justify how to use the terms agnostic and atheist, because so many of them sometimes can't even get past that, and we're over here talking about very deep aspects of religion.
Yeah.
And it's crazy, man. And I think a lot of it has to do with the semantics, and and the fact that they're even arguing over that of how to properly use those terms just shows that we're still evolving, and it's very important to come to terms with our semantics, just like it's very important to come to terms of what really happened in history. But to what degree is that important over something like waking up the world today and uniting people, and
yeah,
that's what I'm curious about.
But
yeah,
so let me tell you something, right? Like, I believe that it is really, really important, really crucial to get your thinking straight with regards to this particular issue. And there are three categories, right? One category is historicist, which means that you believe that the Jesus stories in the Bible refer to a particular flesh and blood person. That's called historicism. Then there's another category, which I suppose you could call it non-historicism, or perhaps fictionalism, where you believe that the stories about Jesus in the Bible don't refer to one particular historical flesh and blood individual. They might refer to multiple people. They might borrow elements of life stories of multiple real people, but they absolutely specifically don't refer to just one person. And then there's a third category, which is called mythicism, which says that the stories are mythological, that they are symbolism. Now, those three categories are related to each other, but they're also distinct. Especially, it's important to understand the difference between fictionalism or non-historicism and mythicism, because they're not quite the same, but they both amount to saying that there was no historical Jesus. So the overall divide is between historical Jesus did exist or historical Jesus didn't exist. And what I'm saying is that it's very important. You'll never fully understand the ego death theory if you don't understand exactly what the difference is between those two positions and why it's so important to spell that out. At least you won't understand how the ego death theory refers to Christianity, how it explains Christianity, unless you can figure out in your mind like the difference between those three positions. So, as I was saying, it started off when I said, what's the meaning of Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection? You said it was about a man being crucified, and then potentially a metaphor for spiritual resurrection.
Honestly, real quickly, and I'm sorry, I will let you go, man. I was just gonna say, I think I was just kind of paraphrasing what I heard from a talk with it's called Jesus and His Religion. I think I linked it to you on the email.
Which one is that? Alan Watts?
Yes, Alan Watts. I don't know if you got to hear it.
I didn't actually hear that one. No, I checked out the main thing that I researched into after our last conversation was the writing of Vladimir Lossky. And I was very interested in that, and I see that there's a lot of overlap between his thinking and Neoplatonism or Plotinus and the related philosophers, and the themes that come up in. I would say Lossky is more like a Christian version of Neoplatonism, but I didn't get round to the Alan Watts talk yet. But I've.
Oh, it's okay. Finish your point, man. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, one point I wanted to make. As an aside, is you do this a lot, Jimmy. Like what you do is you paraphrase other people's thoughts, and then sometimes I get confused between what you're saying other people have said, like Alan Watts and Lossky and those kind of people, and what you actually think.
Man, I agree. You're right. If it's important to know the distinction, I gotta stop doing that, man. It's I don't know what it is. I guess I've heard so many Buddhist stories. I don't know if you've heard the Buddha when he's arguing with an atheist and a theist, and he tells the atheist that he doesn't believe in God, and he tells the theist that he does. So they both think they're right. But he was trying to make a greater point than that. And I don't know. I guess I try to speak from that, and maybe you're right. It's wrong to do that. But what I'm saying is that to understand the accurate history, it may be fruitful to understand the ego death theory accurately, but I don't know. I like I said, I think I come from a place where I want people to, I guess, start waking up first before we start realizing what happened. But the past is important, man. At the same time, like I don't know how to explain it. But no, let you finish your point, man. And maybe we'll get somewhere deeper after that.
There's an awful lot of points here, and I'm not sure, like, let's try to be as systematic as possible, but my belief is that given time we'll get to the bottom of this, and we've already
and I do want to say that these terms that you're bringing up, I am familiar with, like mythicist, the historical version of Christ. I don't know if you've listened to Richard Carrier, or you even care to hear his version of that. I've also heard him use those terms like frequently. I think he argues against the historical Jesus.
He does. Richard Carrier is a hugely important figure in this conversation. He's one of the great mythicist thinkers, where he would deny that Jesus is a real person. But let me ask you a question, okay? What do you understand? Can you see a difference between non-historicism and mythicism? Or do you think that those two positions are just one and the same? They're just two different words for the same belief about Jesus?
I do ultimately see it as because like in either case you have a mystic. You have the symbolic expression of a mystic, or you have a case of a literal mystic who, like, for instance, I was, like I said, you caused me to mull over all this, and I was like, is the ego death theory implying that none of these founders were real? Plotinus was fake, not fake, but not a real person. Gautama, Muhammad, so forth. Is it all of them?
Plotinus cannot have been fake because of the Enneads. So
what about Mani?
Okay, I don't. How do you spell that?
Mani, the Manichaean religion that was once rivaled Christianity, like not too long ago.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I wouldn't be able to answer that because I don't know enough about Mani. But my point with Plotinus is that somebody has to have written the Enneads, right? And
yes.
So even if it wasn't a person named Plotinus, it might have been someone else, or who it might have been multiple people. Texts like that don't write themselves. However, Jesus didn't leave behind any body of writing.
Oh yes, no, I agree with that. Yeah, there's a lot of people can't explain the absence of historical record during the first century. Yeah,
and also the fact that Christianity really seems to have come more from Saint Paul rather than Jesus, and Saint Paul's connection with Jesus isn't really a historical one. It's more that he had some kind of supernatural mystical vision of the resurrected Jesus when he was on the road to Damascus, rather than actually meeting the historical Jesus. But actually, Jimmy, I think you misunderstood the question that I asked you. I didn't ask you what is the difference between historicism and mythicism. I asked you what is the difference between non-historicism and mythicism, and if they are just the same thing, or if there's actually a meaningful difference between them. And this question I'm asking you really links into Richard Carrier. But anyway, do you understand the question I'm asking?
Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. You said non-historicism.
Yeah, non-historicism, yeah.
Let me see. Well, how would you define non-historicism? I don't think maybe you're more familiar with that term than I am.
Well, it's just the inverse of historicism. So you know what historicism means. Historicism means that there was a person, Jesus, who those stories refer to. So non-historicism is the negation of that belief.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Coming from Richard Carrier, I know you said he's an important figure, but he also kind of has an agenda. Like, for instance, I've never even asked you. I've been curious. Like, what do you consider yourself? Do you identify as theist, atheist, or
I identify as a disciple of Michael Hoffman, as an adherent of the ego death theory. And the ego death theory has a position on that question, theism, atheism, historicism, mythicism, that kind of thing, which is entirely unique to the ego death theory.
No, you went blank. It went mute for like maybe a split, maybe like 3 seconds.
Oh, okay. You asked me, do I identify as a theist or an atheist,
yes,
a historicist or a mythicist, that kind of thing. Now, what I identify as is an adherent of the ego death theory. The whole of my thinking about Christianity and about religion is thoroughly, fully informed by my understanding of the ego death theory, which is precisely what I'm trying to communicate to you. And I haven't got there yet, okay, but I'm on the way, and I've made some progress.
But I guess I can see that. But or let me put it this way, Matt. You've seen my cause with Atheist Experience.
Matt Dillahunty.
Matt. I called into the show one time. When you call into the show, they do a screening, right? And the first question they ask you is, are you atheist or theist?
I remember Matt commented that when you came up on the screen, you were neither, and he didn't understand that.
Yeah, so I didn't even mean to go into that semantic argument with Matt. What had happened was I had prepared a question that, I don't know if you remember the question that Graham asked Richard Dawkins, Graham Hancock.
Oh no, what was the question?
He told him that if that shamans, they go to these spiritual realities. He said, have you ever had firsthand experience of what these shamans are talking about by taking these substances? and if you haven't, would you consider trying it? And if not, why not? And basically he was asking him if he would ever do ayahuasca, and he was challenging him to do it. Like, he was going to dose him, I guess. I don't know what he thought was going to go down, but it was an interesting question, and Dawkins gave an interesting answer. But and my whole point was to call in and ask that same question to Matt, and he diverted the conversation, or he diverted me from even asking my question. I was going to ask the question and then hang up, like, I'm going to go off the line so you can answer the question, like some callers do. And instead it went into this semantic argument because he had an issue of me being neither.
Yeah.
And so what I was going to ask you was, Matt told me, he's like, he kind of put this dichotomy to me. He's like, you either believe or you don't.
But do you disagree with that?
With that idea, if you believe or you don't? That
you have to have either one or the other, and that those are the only two options? Or do you feel like there's a third option which he's missing out?
Well, I guess what he was he eventually got it down to this. He's like, are you declaring there's a God or are you not? Are you in some way declaring there's a God or are you not?
And so that's just the same question. It's the same as the question, do you believe in God or not? Are you a theist or are you an atheist? Yeah.
Yeah. I guess it is. But sometimes they disassociate belief because it's not knowledge. Belief is one thing, knowledge, it gets into so many semantic things. I think that's why it's so complicated. And I think that's why there's arguing it today on these streams. But the way I interpreted was like, well, how should I characterize perennialism? Is it theist or is it atheist?
And what's your answer to that?
Well, when I started looking into it, I looked at, I went into the etymology, of course, the origin of these terms, and I found out that the person who coined the word theism was actually a perennialist by the name of Ralph Cudworth, that I think lived in the 1800s. When he was one of these famous Platonists, Cambridge Platonists.
He coined the term atheism or theism?
Yeah, theism.
Right.
Theism, yeah. And he was a perennialist. He was an adherent of the perennial philosophy. And so, it got me thinking, like, well, what is this? I that's why I say, I think it really kind of, sometimes you can describe it as a semantic argument, like this word we use, God, right, to refer to these things. Because if you look up atheism in the dictionary, it's going to tell you something, whatever it tells you, it's going to contrast that with the word God. Someone who doesn't believe in God.
Yeah.
As though God were the only name for the divine. I'm sure you remember Lao Tzu saying, the name that can be named is not the eternal name.
Yes.
But despite that, they use this word God. So I think perennialism kind of refers to a source, and I think the Hindus, all these mystics got it right. It never had a name. It's a nameless source, but yet we have given it these names.
But even by calling it a nameless source, you're still giving it a name, right?
Yeah, you're still giving it a name, yeah. And that's why I think, I don't know if you've heard these Alan Watts talks where he says, if you were going to ask a guru or one of these Zen masters to get on the stage to give a speech, he wouldn't even say a word. He might hit the microphone with his fan and then walk off the stage. Because he knows that words can't, they're going to only mislead people.
Yeah, I recall Joseph Campbell said something very similar about a Buddhist teacher who, instead of giving a talk, he just held up a flower, and that was it. So
you're saying that you wouldn't put it in this dichotomy? Like, if you were asked, is it something that declares God, or is it something that it doesn't declare God? You would say it's neither.
That it's a different domain of concern from that. So you have two separate domains of concern, which I want to outline, right? One of them is metaphysics and epistemology. Now, when you talk about the distinction between theism and atheism, is there a God? Is there not a God? Do you believe in God or do you not believe in God? That whole set of questions and issues falls in the domain of metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics is the question of what exists and what doesn't, and epistemology is the question of what is knowledge and what is belief? What can be known? What can be believed? What is the difference between those two things? So the whole debate between theists and atheists falls under the subject rubric of metaphysics and epistemology. Now, what I'm saying, which I think Matt Dillahunty does not recognize, and I felt that you were trying to communicate this to him and he was not seeing what you were saying to him, is there is a second, entirely distinct sphere of concern, which is phenomenology. Phenomenology is entirely distinct from metaphysics and epistemology. So whereas metaphysics and epistemology deals with things existing and whether or not a particular person believes in a particular thing existing or not existing, phenomenology has nothing to do with that. Phenomenology is just about the description of experiences and the experiences themselves. Phenomenology literally means the study of experience or the study of consciousness. And I think that what you call perennialism and the ego death theory and anything which concerns personal mystical experiences, that has to come under the subject heading of phenomenology, and it really doesn't have very much, if anything, to do with metaphysics and epistemology. So the atheist mental framework, which you are constantly encountering when you talk to people like Matt and Tracy on the Atheist Experience, they only recognize the first of those two subject headings, metaphysics and epistemology. They have no appreciation whatsoever that phenomenology is even a thing. So there's two separate claims here. The first is the claim that religion is a matter of metaphysics and epistemology, that religion is about metaphysics and epistemology. And the second claim is that religion is not about metaphysics and epistemology. It's actually about the phenomenology of the mystical experience. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I get what you're saying. With the way I think you give the atheist experience too much credit, man. I don't even think they recognize metaphysics.
Well, they're always talking about it. They're always talking about whether or not God exists, right? Which is a metaphysical question.
I mean, they don't believe it, but yeah, they try to talk about it. And I think that's why a lot of the callers that get into metaphysics, they find incomprehensible.
But even if they,
but no, I get what you're saying though. I was gonna phrase it this way. I don't. Are you familiar with Steve McRae?
No, I'm not. No.
I'll link you to some of his stuff, dude. He's been getting really interesting lately. He's been garnering a lot of attention because he's been invoking these semantic arguments that we're discussing here.
Yeah.
And he gets real deeply into them. I mean, he goes out of his way to write to people, philosophers, doctors who've contributed to the semantics and the philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
And when you actually look up these terms, yeah. So he'll cite all that, and I think he's on a stream right now as we speak. Discussing these things. But he said something real interesting last night. That epistemology is like, to what extent can you be valid that this knowledge is true?
Mm-hmm. Right? Absolutely, yeah.
And so how when we talk about mystical experience, they emphasize William James, the noetic quality.
Yep.
that you just know it's true. It's just intuitively a fact. Like the way when you see your mom, that's your mom, like the image of her face, or it's so directly intuitive like that. Like there's no questioning it. And I guess epistemology, to me, someone who's really wrapped in epistemology will always question it. Like they can't even accept the mystical experience. And I think I was talking about something this last time when I said one of these guys, another guy I listened to on YouTube, he said the mind is a professional at denying the truth.
Right.
You know, like one of these atheists could have a very profound mystical experience, but manage to just shunt it out. They may go through hell during it, but they may manage to ignore it. Like Bill Richards talked about one of his patients when he was in the 60s. You know Bill Richards, right?
Yes.
Okay. He did a talk recently, man, at Alex Gray's house. I think when on that Saturday that we were going to do that first podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he went. He did a talk at Alex Gray's house, but you had to be present to hear it. I don't think they streamed it. Yeah, but yeah, it would have been kick-ass to go. But what I was gonna say was he was talking about how he's become this kind of like guru at not a guru, but this like Overwatch of at Johns Hopkins, because he's had experience back in the 60s of dosing people with psychedelics, you know, like of this, the person who overwatches someone when they're tripping.
A trip sitter.
Yeah, a trip sitter. He's become this like guru trip sitter over there. And but he wasn't always like that. He said he recounts like a student he had in the 60s and Girdingham, I think. And he was saying that he didn't really try to talk to him. He should have, but this guy burrowed his head in the corner of the couch. And Bill Richards said he tried to call his name, but he was just unresponsive. He just stayed in the couch with his head like burrowed and his back facing him. And, you know, hours went by and he finally got up and he yelled in German, "I made it!" And Bill Richards said when he described the experience, he had been fighting a violent vortex, like this psychedelic vortex that was coming at him, and like he was swimming against it. And he said if he just allowed him to go down with the waves and go down it, he may have discovered something that day, but he decided to fight it. And I think the mind could fight, man. Like even maybe some of these, you know, heavier, profound trips, you know, the mind could manage to fight it. But I mean, I hope I didn't go off too much of a tangent, you know.
It's fine.
I really wanted to get at that, you know, I think the semantics are just as important as the historicity, you know, because they're one and the same. And if we can't get clear with our terms, man, we're not going to be able to get clear with anything, you know?
I agree, yeah. To return to something you were just saying, that perhaps an atheist, one of these hardcore atheists that you talk to, would be able to have a mystical experience, but it wouldn't necessarily change whether they believe in God or not.
I think it would be hard for them to do it. Like, you know what I mean? Like to deny the trip. I think it takes a lot of mental, they can't deny the hell maybe they went through, but then there's other cases too. Like I've spoken to atheists who, like I met this one guy who was actually in, the DMT studies in the 90s with, Rick Strassman. Mm-hmm. And he volunteered. He got the intravenous dose, and he recalls having a state of mind where there was no time. He said the way he described it, he's like time froze. And I try to point out to him, but you do realize that this is how they characterize the mystical experience. They say you have a sensation of having, you know, either beyond having a sense of transcending time and space, or you have a sense of there being no time at all, or, you know, but he just said it in a different way. Time froze. But he said, I could see how someone might consider that a mystical experience, but I don't see that as God. But you see, I think he was already convinced with a preconceived notion of what he thinks God should be, instead of realizing what it always has been for humanity throughout history, according to the perennial philosophy. You know, like I think when these mystics have talked about when the mystics talks about Theoria, the vision of God, they were always referring to these revelations in consciousness. Mm-hmm. They didn't mean anything else. So I guess it's hard to come to terms with the terms, you know, like, and the way we use these things, man, because it almost sounds like if someone wants to use phrases in a certain way, they want to dictate the language. And I'm not saying if you push ego death theory may be the case. It may be correct. And I don't doubt it, man. Maybe I haven't studied it as deeply as you have, and you certainly inspired me to. But it may be the case, but we have to translate that into our language, man. And we're all, I just mentioned this live stream of these atheists. They're trying to come to terms on how to define how the term atheist should be used in relative to God,
Right.
As though it's necessary, as though there's no third component. Like you're saying, how you kind of feel that you don't identify with either.
So I think that we agree with each other about this point, that atheists are really solely focused on a very narrow question, which is whether God exists, yes or no.
They're hung up on the word God, yeah.
Right. But me and you are coming from a different angle, where we're saying that the relevant issue isn't whether God exists, yes or no. The relevant issue is what a mystical experience is like, and what a mystical experience does to a person, to the way a person thinks, the way a person believes.
Yes.
And that you can't say that the result, that an inevitable result of having a mystical experience is that a person starts to believe in God. Mystical experience just isn't about that. It's more about these other things, like having a feeling of unity or having a feeling of time stopping, that kind of thing, where people don't even mention the word God. So in that regard, these atheist people are missing the point of religion. They're missing the point of mysticism-inspired religion by ignoring the phenomenology of mystical experience and focusing instead so narrowly on this question of whether God exists and what you believe.
Do you mind if I mention one more example?
No, go for it. No.
The same lady I was referring to earlier that Michael interviewed, Dina Bazer. After the experience,
the cancer patient.
She Michael asked her, like, so she said a phrase that kind of confused him, because she said she was an atheist, but she said that during the experience she was bathed in God's love, and then and so Michael said, well, how do you make sense of that? Like that seems contradictory. And she said, well, we atheists don't have a word big enough to describe it that way, so that's why I say God's love. And, Michael kind of just wrote it off as like, whoa, William James said the mystical experience is paradoxical. Maybe this is the paradoxical aspect of the mystical experience. This atheist is using this religious vocabulary to describe this experience. And I don't know if there's, like, if you relate too much one way, if you're like a theist, you might say like, whoa, once she uses this language, she's already trumped her atheist card. Because she's just not realizing this is just an aspect of this experience of God that mystics have been explaining, of what they resonate with, this unconditional love, the transcendence of time and space, so on and so forth, the unity of all things. She's borrowing this language, but she's not realizing it's part of what they've been describing as God all along.
Right.
Yeah. And so, how do you compromise,
Right. I see what you're saying. I mean, I think everything that we're talking about now is a point of agreement between the two of us. And I'd like to ask you to try to simplify things. I'd like to introduce a new pair of terms, and I want to know if you've already heard of them. Are you familiar with the terms exoteric and esoteric?
Oh, yeah. I mean, when you look up perennial philosophy on Wikipedia, that's one of the first things it says. It says a source from which all esoteric and exoteric knowledge derives from.
So would you agree that there is exoteric religion and there is esoteric religion, and those two things are not the same?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
So how do you understand the difference between exoteric and esoteric religion specifically?
Man, I've read so many things on pertaining to this. I mean, exoteric could be all the way down to like how the kind of the Eleusinian mysteries were described. This very kind of secretive thing that was only practiced once a year, and you shouldn't, like, even mentioning it is blasphemy. So I mean, it was that well respected, and the purpose of keeping it esoteric, I don't know. I guess because for the enlightened few can enjoy it. I have no idea, but and exoteric, I don't know. I guess I kind of see that as ranging all the way from how fundamentalists might interpret a religion, or literalists, and to all the way to the carefree kind of like on the surface way people practice religion in mainstream cultures and societies today. Like, just kind of going to church every Sunday because their parents did it, or I don't know, like it can, I think it can reside on this spectrum. I don't know if maybe you have a more rigid explanation.
Yeah, I didn't feel that the explanation you just gave was really that clear. So I think it would be useful for us to try to really clarify what the difference is. So I mean, the prefix exo means outside, and the prefix eso means inside, right?
Yes.
And I think that the difference between exoteric and esoteric religion really cuts to the core of what it is that you and me are currently talking about. And what it basically amounts to is two different ways of understanding what religion is about. Now, the exoteric version of religion is about things on the outside, hence the name exo.
Oh,
and
okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
And then conversely, logically, esoteric religion is about things on the inside, which is to say the inside of the human mind, the inside of human experience. So does that make sense?
No,
to you?
Yes, I get that, I that's kind of what I was hinting at. I maybe it was kind of vague, and when you get very deeply into these things, I think that's the distinction, the ultimate distinction that's made. Like I don't know if you remember, I mentioned how the mystics use Theoria to distinguish between what they considered true spiritual knowledge to false spiritual knowledge. And there is an excerpt that I would like to read, if you don't mind, man.
No, go for it. No,
okay,
that's fine.
In the Orthodox churches, Theoria is regarded as true spiritual knowledge, in contrast to false or incomplete knowledge of rational thought, conjecture, speculation, dianoia, stochastic, or dialectics. After illumination or Theoria, humanity is in union with God and can properly discern or have holy wisdom. Hence, Theoria, the experience or vision of God, silences all humanity. The most common false spiritual knowledge is derived not from an experience of God, but from reading another's experience of God and subsequently arriving at one's own conclusion, believing those conclusions to be indistinguishable from the actual experienced knowledge. And I think that kind of gets to like the crux of that distinction. But
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I guess what I was trying to express in the last statement I made was that, when you're looking, are you familiar with this term, eisegesis?
No, I don't think I am.
Eisegesis.
Is that EI?
EI, yeah.
EI. Oh, right. Yeah, I think I've seen that word.
Yeah, it means to interpret religious scripture, but you're adding your own bias input into what you're reading. And there's an opposite term to that called exegesis, which means to go to the original intended meaning of the scripture, with trying to deeply study as close as you can find to the original context of which these things were expressed. Also referred to as hermeneutics. Exegesis completely ignores and denies eisegesis, and in fact it's just seen as you're leading yourself astray, you're misleading yourself, and I think a lot of people unwittingly practice eisegesis all the time. A lot of religious people do. And man, can you still hear me, or did I go blank?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, okay.
I can hear you fine.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I guess I was trying to put it on a spectrum to just kind of describe even people who casually refer to themselves as religious, as opposed to people who really deeply study this stuff, like you and I.
Yeah, you made a similar distinction last week as well, in saying that there is a whole lot of people who would describe themselves as Christian, but really it's just because they go with the motions of being a Christian, which means like going to church on a Sunday and professing to believe and professing to be a Christian, but it's not a very serious, it doesn't come from the core of their soul. Whereas a really serious Christian is a much more spiritually committed version of what it means to be a Christian, as opposed to this casual kind of thing.
Yeah. You just kind of reminded me. It wasn't really a joke. It was something Alan Watts mentioned. He said this guy was signing. He was checkboxing this form, and it asked, "What religion are you?" And he had to write it out, and he put pedestrian when he really meant Presbyterian. But he was that, I don't know, it was that lax that it didn't. I guess it didn't matter to him. But
right. I'd like to wrap up the conversation for this week, but I think we should do this again as soon as possible, ideally next weekend if we could. I'd like to leave you with an analogy, which I think is a really brilliant way of understanding the difference between exoteric religion and esoteric religion, right? You know how when you go to a restaurant, you have a menu and it presents descriptions of all the different foods that the restaurant has. So being an exoteric religionist is kind of like going to a restaurant, reading the descriptions of the food on the menu, and then leaving the restaurant. Whereas an esoteric religionist actually eats the meal.
It's an interesting metaphor. I will be thinking about it, man. Until our next encounter. But I don't know if you want to offer maybe a certain add a certain interpretation. I don't know, or if you want to just leave it at that.
No, so exotericism is surface level understanding of religion, where you read the descriptions of the mystical experience, and your whole concern is about the descriptions of the mystical experience, but you don't actually have the mystical experience firsthand personally for yourself. So your religion is based on the mystical experience of other people, such as that of Jesus and Mary. And
you don't mind if I share a metaphor with you?
Go for it.
Okay. All right. I think it's Jung. I think Jung said, if you want to understand the depths of consciousness, you can't be content to sail back and forth in front of the shore. You have to go deep into the jungle, no matter how afraid you may be.
Absolutely. So it's the difference between worshipping the symbol versus worshipping the thing that the symbol refers to.
Or my favorite one, I think, is the one Bruce Lee used in his movies, man, the Zen one of the finger pointing to the moon. Right,
so it's the difference between the finger itself versus the moon. Is that?
Yes.
I don't recall which Bruce Lee movie does that come from?
Man, I don't. It's one where he's a master and he's telling his student this, and it's from these old Zen koans, and the student gets whacked on the head, and of course Bruce Lee does the whacking. So I'll send you the clip, man. I'll find it for you. And
please do. Yeah.
But hey,
it's been great chatting with you,
it's been really interesting, dude. And I will send you all those other stuff of the ones I told you about, how they're streaming now, about how to even come to terms with these terms. It's insane, man. Yeah. But it's a cool dialogue, and I think we're part of the unfoldment, and we have something fresh to bring to the table, and not a lot of people have heard it.